When you look back at the grand sweep of human history, especially those moments when an entire civilization completely pivots, you usually expect this massive soundtrack of chaos.
Oh, absolutely. You picture the clash of iron shields or, cities burning.
Right, armies marching, or at the very least, a totally deafening, fractured debate inside some grand political hall.
Hmm.
I feel like we've been conditioned to associate massive historical change with just overwhelming volume.
Yeah, that's the standard historical model.
But today, we're going to examine one of the most profound, world-altering paradigm shifts in the entire history of the Viking Age. A moment where society fundamentally changed its core identity, its spiritual reality, and its geopolitical allegiance. And it doesn't sound like a battlefield at all.
No, it sounds like an individual lying on the ground, completely silent.
I mean, I really want you to picture this scene. The year is 1000 AD.
Hmm.
We're in Iceland, standing on this vast, windswept geological rift valley called Thingvellir.
Such a dramatic landscape, too.
Oh, it really is. And this is the site of the Althing, the Great Summer Assembly. So the entire nation is essentially camped out on this plain. We're talking about the chieftains, the free farmers, the warriors, the merchants, everybody.
The whole society in one place.
Exactly. And they are standing on the absolute razor-thin edge of a catastrophic civil war. Like, this is not a dispute over land borders or trade tariffs. This is a division over the very soul of the society.
The stakes literally could not be higher.
Right. On one side of this plain, you have the faction that holds fiercely to the old gods, to Odin, to Thor, to the ancient localized ways of their ancestors. And then on the other side, you have this rapidly growing faction that has completely embraced the new faith that's sweeping across Europe, which is Christianity.
And this tension has escalated to the point where these two camps are literally arming themselves. They are preparing to shatter their unified society into pieces.
Which is terrifying, because in the context of medieval Europe, when a religious division reaches the point of armed camps refusing to acknowledge the same legal structure, I mean, what usually happens...
An imminent, devastating massacre. That is usually the only historical outcome.
Yeah, you expect the swords to be drawn and the valley to just run red. But here is the astonishing reality of what actually happens next. Rather than slaughtering each other, rather than plunging their entire society into like a generational blood feud, the leaders of these two furious armed factions take a step back from the abyss.
It's incredible restraint.
It is. They make a choice that is so deeply counterintuitive it practically defies human nature. They decide to take the fate of their nation's soul, the entire question of which God will govern their reality, and they entrust it to a single man.
Just one guy.
One guy. They swear a sacred binding oath to abide by whatever he decides, and that man doesn't stand up and deliver some fiery rallying speech to the troops. He retreats to his booth, he lies down, he pulls a heavy wool cloak completely over his head, and he just stops moving.
For a full day and a night.
Yes. For 24 hours, he stays there in absolute sensory deprivation, and an entire, angry, heavily armed nation just waits in the howling wind.
I mean, it is arguably the ultimate cliffhanger in medieval history. The destiny of a culture isn't being decided by a cavalry charge. It's being meticulously engineered in the mind of one individual under a piece of wool.
It's so wild. So welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to pull apart the mechanics of perhaps the most remarkable, bloodless decision of the whole Viking Age.
We're going to get right into the weeds on this one.
Absolutely. We're diving into a stack of historical sources, primarily the Icelandic book, or the Book of Icelanders, which was written by Ari the Wise. And we want to unpack how this unique society managed to change its gods without a single drop of blood being spilled.
Which, again, is the exception, not the rule.
Totally. We're going to examine the crushing geopolitical pressure they were under, the brilliant, highly localized legal mechanics of their culture, and how they pulled off this absolute masterpiece of reasoned compromise.
Because to truly grasp the sheer gravity of that silence under the cloak, we first have to understand the sheer volume of the violence happening everywhere else in the Norse world.
Right, context is everything here.
The contrast is essential, because the peaceful resolution in Iceland is miraculous specifically because it's such an extreme anomaly. I mean, the transition from localized pagan belief systems to centralized Christianity across the rest of Scandinavia was it was not driven by gentle persuasion or philosophical enlightenment.
No, it definitely wasn't a matter of traveling monks handing out illuminated manuscripts and having, like, polite theological debates over a horn of mead.
Not at all. Across the broader Norse world, Christianity arrived as a geopolitical battering ram, and it was wielded primarily by ambitious, aggressive kings.
So this is very much a top-down transformation.
Exactly. We're looking at a massive shift driven by monarchs like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, and crucially for our story, Olaf Tryggvason in Norway. A king would secure his own baptism, often while abroad or seeking alliances with Christian powers, and then return home to impose that new faith on his subjects.
An imposition in this era is a pretty heavy word.
Oh, it meant utilizing the full coercive power of the royal military apparatus.
Wow. Let's break down the mechanics of that royal obsession for a second. Because on a surface level, personal religious awakenings obviously happen. But this feels highly systematic. The monarchs of Scandinavia didn't just convert themselves, they viewed the Christianization of their populations as an absolute political necessity.
Yeah, the kings realized early on that Christianity offered an entirely new, highly sophisticated toolkit for ruling. Under the old pagan system, power was very decentralized.
Right.
A king was powerful, certainly, but he was essentially just the most successful chieftain among many. His authority was constantly checked by other powerful families, and, it didn't come with a mandate from a single omnipotent creator.
Oh, right. The pagan gods were many, they were chaotic, and I'm guessing they didn't particularly care about enforcing a human king's tax policies.
Exactly. They were deeply unhelpful for centralizing government. But Christianity introduces the concept of the divine right to rule. One omnipotent God in heaven directly translates to the legitimacy of one absolute king on earth.
It elevates the monarch categorically above the rest of the nobility.
It does. It fundamentally rewrites the political operating system.
Okay, using a software analogy, it's like you're replacing a localized peer-to-peer network of independent chieftains with a highly centralized enterprise-level system.
That's a great way to put it.
And the benefits of that new system were massive.
Yeah.
Joining the Christian world meant gaining political legitimacy in the eyes of powerful southern empires. I mean, it opened up lucrative trade agreements, political alliances, dynastic marriages, all these things that were strictly closed off to pagans.
And beyond the international legitimacy, the church provided an infrastructure that paganism simply lacked. The church came with a highly organized bureaucracy.
Oh, so like administrators, literacy.
Yes. Administrators, Latin literacy, written legal codes, and a hierarchical chain of command that reported directly up to the top. A king could utilize this network of bishops and priests to project royal control into remote valleys that were previously fiercely independent.
So the consolidation of royal authority and the spread of the cross were functionally the exact same project.
They were indistinguishable.
Going back to that software analogy, it's like the new CEO, the king, realizes his entire company is way too fragmented. Every regional branch is running its own legacy code, doing its own thing, venerating local deities. So he brings in a massive, centralized software suite. He mandates that everyone must migrate to this new system.
Right.
But instead of just, firing the people who refuse to update,
Yeah.
he brings in the military.
Yeah, the reality of this enforcement on the ground was incredibly traumatic. The conversion of Norway under Olaf Tryggvason involved forced baptisms on a mass scale.
It's horrible.
Royal retinues would march into a district, tear down the ancient sacred shrines, smash the wooden idols of Thor and Freyr, and demand total submission.
And if you said no?
Those who actively resisted this top-down mandate faced torture, blinding, mutilation, or exile. It was a coercive eradication of a people's worldview. It targeted their connection to their ancestors and the entire rhythm of their daily lives.
I was actually thinking about how the show Vikings, Valhalla, captures the visceral terror of this paradigm shift.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, the entire narrative engine of that show is built around this bloody, unforgiving clash between the fervent defenders of the old ways and the violently advancing cross. You see the massacres, you see these communities literally torn apart by holy war. It portrays the chaos and the uncompromising brutality of the era perfectly.
It really does a great job showing that on a human level.
And realizing that this systemic violence was the standard operating procedure for conversion. It makes the story of Iceland stand out in incredibly sharp relief. Iceland is basically the historical road not taken.
The fundamental reason Iceland could take a different path brings us to their unique domestic situation. They avoided a top-down royal conversion because they actively refused to have a top.
Right. Iceland didn't have a king.
None at all.
We have to look at the genesis of the Icelandic settlement. because this island was populated by fiercely independent-minded people. I mean, many of them had literally loaded their families and their wealth onto long ships, specifically to flee the growing, centralizing power of Harald Fairhair back in Norway.
Right, they were essentially political refugees who were very well armed.
Exactly. They arrived on this volcanic rock in the North Atlantic and deliberately constructed a society completely devoid of an executive monarch. There was no king, no standing royal army, and definitely no centralized police force to enforce any kind of religious decree.
Iceland was a society governed entirely by a highly complex system of law and assembly. Power was distributed among local chieftains, who were known as Goar.
So without an executive power, the question of religious conversion simply couldn't be resolved by a royal army marching into Thingvellir. The decision had to be negotiated collectively, right, from the bottom up.
That's right. But the absence of a king certainly didn't make them immune to the cultural shifts happening across the water. The new religion was seeping into the groundwater of Icelandic society regardless.
How is it getting in? Trade.
Trade, mostly. You have Icelanders serving as mercenaries in England or the Byzantine Empire, trading in mainland Europe and bringing the new faith back with them. You also have active missionaries arriving on their shores.
Oh, right. Like Thangbrand?
Yes, the missionary Thangbrand, who was sent by the Norwegian king. And Thangbrand was not exactly a gentleman. The historical accounts say he actually killed several Icelanders who mocked him or opposed his preaching.
Wait, really? The missionary was just murdering hecklers?
Pretty much. So over time, a significant influential chunk of the Icelandic population genuinely converts. They become devoutly Christian. But simultaneously, you have a deeply entrenched, highly traditional population looking at this new religion and absolutely refusing to yield an inch.
And that division began to harden dangerously, I imagine, because religion permeated every single aspect of Norse life.
It dictated everything: the agricultural calendar, the validity of legal oaths, dietary customs, the structure of community gatherings, everything. As these two camps polarized, you had a society whose fundamental understanding of reality, ethics, and community law was diverging into two incompatible systems.
And as if that internal sociological pressure cooker wasn't threatening enough, a massive external threat starts bearing down on them. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, having violently converted much of his own territory, he turns his gaze toward the North Atlantic. He decides that Iceland, the colony of holdouts and descendants of Norwegian exiles, must also bend the knee to the new faith.
And Olaf Tryggvason possessed immense geopolitical leverage, and he was entirely willing to weaponize the Icelandic economy to achieve his goals.
Let's talk about the economic reality of Iceland, because it's crucial here. They are a subarctic island nation, which means they're deeply dependent on foreign trade, and Norway is their primary gateway to Europe.
Right. They can't survive in isolation.
Exactly. Iceland produces wool and hides, but they desperately need timber to build their longships and their houses, and they need imported grain and malt to survive and, obviously, to brew beer.
Which was very important.
Very important. And King Olaf understands this vulnerability perfectly. He effectively threatens a total embargo. He closes Norwegian ports to Icelandic merchants.
But he goes much further than a simple embargo. There were many prominent young Icelanders, sons of the most powerful chieftains living in Norway at the time, either seeking their fortune or establishing trade networks. Olaf arrests them.
Oh, wow. Just rounds them up.
Yeah. He takes men like Kjartan Olafsson, a highly celebrated figure in the sagas, as hostages. He sends a crystal-clear message to the Icelandic elite. You will embrace Christianity, or your sons will be executed, and your trade routes will be permanently severed.
So the dynamic of the debate in Iceland shifts instantly. It is no longer a philosophical or theological argument about the nature of the divine.
Not at all.
It transforms into a harsh, pragmatic crisis of national survival. The Christian faction in Iceland can point to the Norwegian threat and say, look, if we don't adopt this faith, we are economically ruined. We will be treated as a hostile pagan insurgency by the most powerful military force in our hemisphere.
We'll be isolated, starved of resources, and eventually Olaf might just send an invasion fleet.
Right. Even the most devout pagan chieftains had to look at that geopolitical reality and recognize that the walls were closing in.
And all of this, the fracturing of the internal social fabric and the crushing external pressure from Norway, it all culminates at the Summer Assembly, the Althing, in the year 1000.
So the entire nation has traveled from the fjords and valleys to gather at Thingvellir. The tension is palpable. The two factions, the pagans and the Christians, have reached a total impasse. The situation is so severe that they literally prepare to renounce their common law.
Yes.
The Christians declared that they will no longer be bound by the laws of the pagans. They are on the verge of splitting into two completely separate peoples, occupying the exact same island, but answering to two different legal codes and two different sets of leaders.
Which, in the context of the Icelandic system, is the absolute definition of societal collapse.
But wait, let me jump in here. If these two groups fundamentally despise each other's worldview at this point, why not just balkanize the island? Like draw a line down the middle. Say pagan law applies in the north and east, and Christian law applies in the south and west. Wouldn't geographic segregation be a highly pragmatic way to solve the immediate threat of violence? Like, just let everyone live under the system they prefer.
I mean, that is a very logical modern solution, but it completely ignores the mechanics of how power and property worked in Iceland.
How so?
Well, the authority of a chieftain, his gudjor, was not strictly geographic. It wasn't a border territory. It was a web of personal contracts. A farmer could choose which chieftain to support, regardless of exactly where his farm was located.
Oh, so you could have a Christian farmer and a pagan farmer living on adjacent properties in the exact same valley, but answering to entirely different chieftains.
Precisely. You cannot draw a geographic line because the populations are completely interwoven. Furthermore, the Icelandic system had no police force. The only mechanism preventing absolute anarchy was the shared legal code, the Gragas, and the agreed-upon system of blood money weregild, which was used to settle disputes.
Ah.
So if a Christian's livestock damages a pagan's crops, and they no longer recognize the same court or the same arbiter or the same value of compensation, the legal system instantly defaults to the ancient mechanism of the blood feud.
Right. So splitting the law doesn't create two peaceful neighboring states. It creates a situation where thousands of heavily armed men are occupying the exact same geographical space with zero agreed-upon rules for conflict resolution.
Exactly. Any minor dispute over grazing rights or, a spilled drink escalates immediately to murder, which demands retaliation, sparking a perpetual civil war.
That is terrifying. And the leaders standing at the Althing understood this calculus perfectly. They were looking down the barrel of total societal annihilation.
And this is the pivot point. This is where the Icelandic story diverges from the bloody history of the rest of the continent. Rather than drawing their weapons and fighting it out, the leaders of both sides pause.
They actually stop.
Yes, they recognize that their shared survival is more important than immediate factional victory. They make a massive, desperate gamble for peace. They agreed to submit this impossible existential crisis to a single arbiter.
They turn to the institution of the law speaker.
They do.
Both factions, the hardcore Christians backed by Norway and the deeply traditional pagans, swear a sacred binding oath that they will obey the ruling of one man, whatever it may be. And they choose Thorgeir Thorkelson, the law speaker of Iceland. Let's unpack the immense weight of that title because law speaker sounds pretty intense.
It was. The law speaker, or Lögreglumaður, was the absolute center of the Icelandic legal universe. Because the society did not yet rely on a written constitution, the law had to be maintained through oral tradition.
Wow, they memorized it.
Yes. The law speaker was an elected official whose primary duty was to memorize the entire incredibly complex body of Icelandic law and to recite 1/3 of it aloud from the law rock at the Althing each year.
So he is a living, breathing human archive.
Precisely. While he didn't possess executive power to command armies or enforce rulings, his moral, legal, and intellectual authority was unparalleled.
He is the supreme repository of precedent. So it makes absolute sense that a society facing a legal crisis would turn to the man who literally embodies the law.
Right.
But here is the detail that elevates this story from a fascinating political maneuver to a mind-blowing leap of faith.
Thorgeir Thorkelson, the man entrusted to decide whether Iceland will submit to the Christian god, is a pagan priest.
He is. He is the Goi of Yosavat.
It's unbelievable. His societal role actively involves organizing and leading the sacrifices to Odin, Thor, and Freyr.
The psychological leap required by the Christian faction here cannot be overstated. It is staggering. I mean, the Christians, who have the geopolitical might of King Olaf threatening to blockade the country on their behalf, actively agree to hand the ultimate decision over to a man whose entire spiritual and political baseline is diametrically opposed to theirs.
They literally give the keys to the kingdom to a heathen priest.
Why? Why would they do that?
Well, it reveals the profound level of societal trust embedded in the Icelandic system. The Christians agreed to this arbitration because they believed that Thorgeir was a man of such immense integrity and intellect that he would prioritize the structural survival of Iceland over his own personal religious allegiance.
So they trusted his pragmatism over his faith.
Yes. They trusted that he wouldn't simply rubber stamp a victory for the old gods, but that he would analyze the crushing economic realities, the threat of the Norwegian embargo, the domestic powder keg, and engineer a ruling that would actually prevent a massacre.
They trusted him to be objective about the very nature of reality. And Thorgeir accepts this unbelievable burden. He accepts the responsibility of deciding the fate of an entire civilization. So he steps away from the screaming crowds, away from the intense lobbying of his fellow chieftains, and he retreats to his booth, his temporary dwelling at the assembly camp.
And this is where things get really dramatic.
He lies down on his bed, he pulls his heavy cloak completely over his head, and he enters a state of absolute silence. And he remains in that state for a full day and a night.
The tension across the plain of Thingvellir during those 24 hours must have been suffocating.
Oh, I can't even imagine. You have thousands of armed men, families, and ambitious leaders just stranded in this geological rift. The wind is whipping off the mountains. The entire society's placed in suspended animation.
Everyone's just holding their breath.
You can just imagine the pagans huddled around their fires, trying to reassure themselves, right? Like, he is the Goi of Yosavat. He sacrifices the horses to Freyr. He will never abandon the gods of our ancestors.
Right, they feel secure.
Meanwhile, the Christians are agonizing over their massive gamble. Did we just hand our salvation over to a man who communes with demons? Will King Olaf slaughter us all when he hears the news? And in the center of this huge storm of anxiety, a single man lies motionless under a wool blanket, building the future of the world in his mind.
It's so cinematic. Now, the historical sources, like Ari the Wise, record the event, but they obviously cannot provide us with Thorgeir's inner monologue. This silence has actually generated centuries of fascinating historical analysis regarding what exactly he was doing under that cloak.
Right, and the theories range from the deeply mystical to the hyper-pragmatic.
Oh, totally.
Like the mystical interpretation suggests that Thorgeir was engaging in a specific ancient pagan ritual known as utiseta, or sitting out. The act of isolating oneself, often covering the head or body to block out all mundane sensory input, was the traditional shamanic method for seeking visions.
Yeah, that's a very common view.
By plunging himself into darkness, he may have been attempting to commune directly with the old gods, seeking spiritual guidance or prophetic insight into how to handle the twilight of their worship.
Right. But then, the alternative, more secular interpretation views this through the lens of supreme focus statesmanship.
How so?
Well, Thorgeir was holding the most complex, high-stakes geopolitical, economic, and spiritual puzzle imaginable. He needed to construct a legal ruling that would appease a foreign king, satisfy a zealous domestic faction, and avoid completely alienating a heavily armed traditionalist base.
Right?
He needed absolute, unbroken concentration. He created an artificial silence to think through the cascading ramifications of every possible legal clause.
Honestly, whether it was a sensory deprivation chamber to seek the wisdom of Odin, or the intense isolating focus of a Supreme Court justice drafting the most important legal opinion in history, the incubation period eventually ends.
Yes, the clock runs out.
The day passes, the night passes. The sun rises over the Almanagja fault line. Thorgeir moves. He throws off the cloak. He steps out of his booth, and he summons every single person at the Althing to the Logberg, the Law Rock.
And the physical acoustics of the Law Rock are vital here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a specific rocky outcropping where the basalt walls of the Rift Valley naturally amplified a speaker's voice across the assembly plain. When Thorgeir took his position there, the silence from the crowd would have been absolute.
From the accounts we have, his opening gambit is a masterpiece of political framing. He doesn't begin by mentioning theology or the threat of Norway or the nature of the soul. He begins by addressing the absolute necessity of social cohesion.
It's brilliant.
It is. He uses historical allegories, referencing times when kings in Norway or Denmark allowed divisions to fester, leading to endless slaughter. He forces the assembly to look directly at the consequences of a fractured law. His core message is uncompromising. If we tear the law apart, we tear the peace apart. A society divided against itself cannot survive the harsh reality of this world.
By anchoring his speech in the shared value of mutual survival, he reminds both factions why they swore the oath to obey him in the first place.
He's laying the groundwork.
Exactly. He establishes that unity is the paramount objective, superseding any individual religious preference. And only after he has built this inescapable logical foundation does he deliver the actual verdict.
And the verdict hits the plain like a hammer. Thorgeir, the pagan priest, looks out at his people and decrees, Iceland will officially choose the new god.
Wow.
The law of the land will be Christian. Every single person on the island who has not yet been baptized must undergo the ritual. The public, state-sanctioned religion of the Icelandic nation has permanently changed.
He legislated against the gods of his own ancestors. I mean, for the devout pagans in the crowd, this pronouncement must have felt like a profound betrayal. Their own arbiter had capitulated to the foreign king.
If Thorgeir had simply stopped speaking at that moment, the pragmatic gamble might have failed.
Oh, absolutely.
Oaths or no oaths, the traditionalists might have drawn their weapons out of sheer humiliated desperation. But Thorgeir reveals the true genius of his time under the cloak. He immediately follows this crushing public mandate with a series of highly specific, brilliantly calculated legal concessions.
Yes, the caveats.
He builds a golden bridge for the pagans to retreat across, ensuring they don't lose their dignity or their most intimate cultural practices.
He introduces 3 major caveats to the new Christian law, and each one is designed to soften the sociological shock of the conversion.
So the first concession involves dietary law. He rules that while the nation is Christian, the people are still legally permitted to eat horse meat.
Which is huge.
Right, because to a modern ear, this sounds like a totally trivial culinary footnote.
Yeah.
Like, who cares about horse meat? But in the context of the Viking Age, it is a massive ideological compromise.
It really is. Horse meat was deeply sacred. It was the primary meat consumed during the Blot, which were the pagan sacrificial feasts dedicated to Odin and Freyr. The Church in Rome strictly forbade its consumption specifically to eradicate those pagan associations.
So by legally protecting this practice, Thorgeir allows the Icelanders to maintain a deep, visceral connection to their ancestral rituals without violating the new state law.
Exactly. And the second concession is significantly darker. It reflects the brutal economic realities of life on the edge of the habitable world. Thorgeir permits the continued practice of utburður, which is the exposure of unwanted infants.
Yeah, this one is tough to hear.
It is. In a society existing on a razor-thin margin of agricultural survival, if a family could not feed another mouth, or if a child was born with severe deformities, the harsh ancient custom was to leave the infant out in the elements to die.
And the Christian faction obviously viewed this as a moral abomination, an absolute sin.
But Thorgeir recognized that you cannot instantly legislate away a society's desperate survival mechanisms. He allowed the practice to remain legal, provided it was done privately.
And that concept of privacy leads to the third and most brilliant concession. Thorgeir decrees that while public pagan rituals are banned, individuals are still legally permitted to make sacrifices to the old gods in secret.
This is the genius part.
It's amazing. If a farmer wants to go into his own barn, close the doors, and offer a prayer and a sacrifice to Thor for a good harvest, the law will not punish him. The state will not police the private conscience of its citizens.
It is an incredibly sophisticated division of public compliance and private belief. Thorgeir essentially recognized that to satisfy King Olaf Tryggvason and secure the vital trade routes, the outward-facing interface of the nation had to be undeniably Christian.
Right, the optics had to be perfect.
Exactly. The longships would fly Christian banners, the public assemblies would open with Christian prayers, and the hostages in Norway would be freed. But internally, the psychological hard drive of the people was granted a grace period.
Okay, the legacy software analogy works perfectly here, but with a crucial nuance. Thorgeir dictates the enterprise-wide software update to keep the network connected to Europe. But he explicitly writes a clause allowing the users to run their old legacy programs locally, off the network, so they don't suffer an immediate psychological system crash.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. And the most remarkable aspect of this grand compromise is that it worked. Both factions looked at the complex reality of the ruling and they realized they could live with it.
Everyone got something.
Yes. The Christians achieved their ultimate geopolitical and theological goal, the official state-sponsored conversion of Iceland and the mandate of baptism. The pagans, while losing the public square, secured enough private breathing room to avoid total humiliation.
They thieved face.
They kept their private dignity, and most importantly, the law remained unified.
The swords stayed in their scabbards. No villages were burned. No shrines were violently smashed by invading armies. The assembly actually concluded in peace.
It's an incredible achievement.
And, when you watch the characters in Valhalla tearing each other apart over faith burning down halls, assassinating each other, it really makes you appreciate Thorgeir. One man under a cloak solved what armies couldn't.
Very true.
And there is a poignant historical legend that perfectly encapsulates the solemnity of this transition. After the Althing concludes, Thorgeir rides back to his farm in northern Iceland. He has just legally bound himself, along with the rest of the nation, to the Christian faith.
So he has to make a choice now.
He does. He enters his own private temple, gathers at the beautifully carved wooden idols of the gods he has served his entire life, carries them to a massive, thundering waterfall near his estate, and hurls them into the churning water.
Wow.
He casts his own gods away, submitting completely to the ruling he engineered for the greater good. And to this day, that waterfall is known as Gugria Foss, the waterfall of the gods.
It is a stunning visual metaphor. The leader dragging his people into a new era by setting the ultimate personal example of sacrifice. He relinquished his own spiritual authority to ensure the survival of his community.
It's an incredibly inspiring display of statecraft. But as we look at the success of the compromise, we also have to slow down and acknowledge the profound emotional and cultural reality of what transpired. I mean, the society survived, yes, but a massive, ancient, and deeply complex world had just been officially legislated into obsolescence.
It is vital that we don't merely view the conversion of the year 1000 as a tidy, triumphant political equation. Something incredibly deep was lost. It was a quiet Ragnarok.
That's a powerful phrase, a quiet Ragnarok. Because for centuries, the Norse worldview was animated by these specific raw forces of nature. The entire cosmological framework, the great world tree Yggdrasil, the protective thunder of Thor holding back the chaos of the giants, the complex honor codes tied to Odin and the Valkyries.
This wasn't just a collection of entertaining campfire stories.
No, it was how they navigated the ocean, how they understood the brutal weather, how they processed grief, life, and death. And now, by a pragmatic legal ruling, that entire framework was being slowly suffocated.
Yeah, the transition from a vibrant, lived religion to a suppressed, private habit carries a heavy psychological toll. The great public temples would eventually rot or be dismantled.
Right.
The communal, unifying feasts of the Blot were replaced by the quiet, isolated rituals of a new faith governed by distant popes and Latin texts. The world was shrinking, becoming less localized and more tethered to the vast, homogenized theology of mainland Europe.
For the traditionalists who genuinely felt the presence of the old gods in the landscape, walking away from Thingvellir that summer must have felt like attending a funeral for their own culture.
Oh, without a doubt.
But this profound sense of loss sets up the ultimate historical paradox. The very mechanism that ended the active worship of the Norse gods is precisely what guaranteed their eternal survival in human memory.
This is such a great point.
Because Thorgeir's ruling was built on compromise, and because the conversion was peaceful and gradual, the old culture was never subjected to the violent, systematic eradication that occurred elsewhere.
This is the crucial, lasting legacy of the Icelandic model. In continental Europe, when a king converted a population by the sword, the old paganism was treated as an active, dangerous heresy.
It wasn't just old news, it was illegal.
Exactly. The ancient poems were banned, the sacred groves were burned, and the memories were deliberately stamped out by the new authorities. We see this with Charlemagne's brutal campaigns against the Saxons and the destruction of the Irminsul.
But in Iceland, because the pagans had actively participated in the legal process of conversion, and because they were granted those private concessions, the transition was incredibly soft. The old stories weren't viewed as a violent rebellion that needed to be crushed by the church.
They transitioned seamlessly from being a rival theology to being a cherished cultural heritage. A grandmother could still recite the epic poems of Thor battling the world serpent, or Odin hanging on the tree to discover the runes without the fear of the bishop's men kicking down her door.
The stories lost their religious threat and became the foundational literature of the Icelandic identity.
And this peaceful preservation leads directly to a literary explosion in the 13th century. Generations after Thorgeir's ruling, Iceland is a firmly, securely Christian nation. But the cultural memory of the old gods is still vibrantly alive in their oral traditions.
And it was deeply Christian Icelanders who took on the monumental task of writing those myths down before they could fade away.
Yes.
This brings us to figures like Snorri Sturluson, who we have discussed in previous deep dives. Snorri was a powerful Christian politician, a wealthy chieftain, and a brilliant historian. He did not worship Odin.
Not at all.
But he recognized that the old poetry, the complex kennings, the mythological references was beautiful and absolutely vital to understanding who the Icelandic people were. So he compiles the Prose Edda, Other anonymous scholars write down the poetic edda, preserving masterpieces like the Voluspa, the Prophecy of the Seeress, and the Havamal, the Words of the High One.
The Christian clerics and historians of Iceland became the meticulous archivists of the very religion their ancestors had voted out of power. They preserved the cultural DNA of the entire Norse world.
And the payoff for you, listening right now, is absolute. Our entire modern conception of Norse mythology exists almost entirely because of this peaceful compromise.
It's wild to think about.
Think about the massive footprint this has on our culture today. The Marvel movies featuring Thor, Loki, and Asgard. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which drew incredibly heavily from the Eddas for its elves, dwarves, and the very concept of Middle-earth. Even the days of our week, Wednesday for Woden, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Frigg.
We take it all for granted.
We do. If Iceland had descended into a violent, bloody, holy war like the rest of Europe, those oral traditions would have been severed by the sword. The manuscripts would never have been written. The myths would have been burned to ash. We simply would not know these stories.
By choosing a pragmatic, peaceful Christianity, Iceland accidentally became the eternal preservation vault for northern paganism. The nation that formally set aside the old gods became the very mechanism by which those gods achieved immortality in human culture.
It is one of the most beautiful, striking ironies in all of human history. They surrendered their religion to save their society, and in doing so, they saved the memory of their religion forever.
To symbolize the immense historical weight of what we've unpacked today, the conversion of Iceland in the year 1000 stands as the supreme expression of the Icelandic genius for law and negotiation.
Without a doubt.
In an age utterly dominated by slaughter, holy war, and top-down royal coercion, a kingless society utilized the tools they had perfected: profound societal trust, complex legal arbitration, and an unwavering commitment to unity to navigate the ultimate spiritual and geopolitical crossroads.
They proved that even the deepest, most existential ideological divisions can be resolved through reasoned, empathetic compromise.
They demonstrated the absolute power of prioritizing a shared reality. They valued their shared identity as Icelanders and their shared legal framework more than they valued total factional victory.
And that brings me to a final lingering thought. Something for you to consider long after this deep dive ends. Thorgeir Thorkelson, a man whose entire life was dedicated to the old gods, was willing to effectively legislate his own religion out of public existence for the greater good of his nation's unity.
He sacrificed his deepest personal beliefs on the altar of the common peace.
He did. And it forces us to look at our own modern, hyper-divided world where everyone seems so deeply entrenched in their ideological camps. What is the religion or core ideology that we would actually be willing to compromise on today to keep our own society from tearing itself apart? Do we still possess the capacity to step under the cloak, block out the noise, and choose the survival of the whole over the victory of the part?
A profound question, and one that resonates deeply when we consider the violent alternatives that history so often provides.
And speaking of history's violent alternatives, we are rapidly approaching the end of an era. We have seen how the Viking world was changing internally, negotiating its identity through law and faith. Next time, 1066, the year the world changed.